Welcome everyone, Will here, and today we're going to be talking about my Xmed. That's right, I had to make another repair. That's 2 repairs now for me. What's up with these tints? Well, the first one was my mistake, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this video. But the second repair, well, that wasn't my mistake. In fact, it comes out to a design flaw or a weak spot that was unique to the original Xmed model that shipped in those first 1 or 2 shipments of the Xmeds. This was not an issue with any of the Xmed 2 tents and the Xmed 1 tents that went out after that, because this issue has since been addressed in the factory. However, for the rest of us who did get in on the first shipment or 2 of these Xmed tents, well, you're going to want to go out and probably check the peak of your tent and look to see if there's any little tears around the edges of where the trekking pole tip goes through, because that is where the weak point in this design flaw was. So some of you have asked me why I didn't take this Xmed out with me on my big Wind River trip last summer. Well, I ended up discovering a little tear on my tent last year as well, and I didn't quite know how to adequately fix it at that point, because unfortunately the way these tents are produced and shipped, there was really no warranty that came with them, and I was not able to return it or get a new one, get it replaced, get it repaired. However, since then I was able to reach out to Dan Durston himself for some advice. That's when Dan told me what actually led to the tear that my tent experienced up here on the peak, and that was due to the grommet. The grommet that holds your trekking pole tip. These original Xmeds were designed with a simple little brass grommet. The standard grommets that you can get at your local hardware store. And unfortunately with those grommets, the diameter of the hole is too wide for some trekking poles out here. So if you have narrower trekking pole tips like I do, it will protrude a little too far through the hole. In fact, it shouldn't be protruding through the grommet hole at all. At most, the trekking pole tip should be flush with the top edge of the grommet. And again, unfortunately, that wasn't the case with my trekking pole tips and the grommets in here. So again, they've since fixed that in the factory with all the runs thereafter. I'm not sure what exactly they did to narrow the grommet hole or what grommets they're using now. So apparently with the initial testing, the trekking poles that were used, the tips on those were wide enough to not be an issue in pushing through on the grommet. But because my trekking poles are narrow, and a lot of budget lower end trekking poles out there are probably going to be the same way, they will go too far through that grommet. And what ended up happening is with enough setups of this tent, it put a little stress on the outer fabric here, and that direct stress ended up developing a little bit of a tear or a little bit of a rip in the outside fabric, the sil polyester here. Now Dan did reassure me that it was more of a cosmetic issue than a functional issue right now, because the fabric underneath actually is very intact, the reinforcement fabric that is. If I had gotten caught in a big storm with that little tear, chances are if any rain did get through, it would have been stopped by that underlayer fabric there, or any leaks would have run down, and ideally down the side of the fly here, and met the ground down. At worst, it would have run down the trekking pole and still stayed outside the tent. So I was fortunate to catch it when I did early on, when it was still really small, only maybe just shy of ½ an inch for me. I've seen other pictures from other people who've experienced tears that looked a lot bigger. And so another fortunate thing for me is that I only found a little tear on the one peak. My other peak so far has been just fine. So for those of you who may have gotten in on that first 1 or 2 shipments of the Xmed 1, you might want to go check your apex peaks there and see if you got a tear like mine. And even if you don't, you're going to want to stay tuned, because after I talk about how I made the quick repair on the little hole that I got, I'm going to talk about the little modification that you can make to the grommets themselves to prevent it from happening in the first place, or if you did get a hole, to prevent it from happening again. So if you did get a hole, you're going to want to gather a few items to make that repair first. And that is, you're gonna wanna get some tenacious tape or some tear aid, specifically type A. And since I had both in my repair supplies, I actually opted for the tear aid type A stuff, because what I've seen, that stuff's just a little bit stronger when under lots of stress. It's a little stretchier, and it's supposed to be really UV resistant as well. That said, tenacious tape's great stuff, so I don't see a reason why that wouldn't work as well. Just use what you got and go with what you can get the easiest between the two. And of course, you're going to want some scissors to cut out a patch of the appropriate size. And then optionally, you might also find a ruler or a little small tape measure handy if you want to be really precise with your measurements. So you're going to want to start out by putting your tent out on a flat working surface, such as a table or something like that. And then spread it out and center that hole that you're going to be patching up, you know, right where you can see it and work with it. And then you're going to want to take that tenacious tape or the tear aid tape and take your scissors and cut out a patch that is roughly at least a ½ an inch beyond the edges of your tear. You're going to want at least a ½ inch margin, I would recommend. And then what I ended up doing is I also ended up rounding the corners of my patch just so I could get a little bit of a smoother application around all the edges and hopefully prevent any of those corners from catching anything and lifting up at any point. Now with the patch cut up to an appropriate size, you're going to want to peel off that backing paper and then take your patch and try and center it over the little tear in your tent there. And you're going to want to make sure that the edges of the tear are lined up as best as they can be against each other. And then put that patch over the tear there so that it's centered right on the tear. And then rub outward, working your way from the center outward and all the way around that patch, and just really give it as much pressure as you can. Again, making sure that as you're doing it, the tent is spread out as much as you can get it. There may be a little bit of wrinkles here and there. That's okay. After you initially work it out around the edges, you can then fold the patch over on itself and continue to put friction and just as much pressure as you can across all the edges from the center outward and around all the edges of the patch. And that should give you a pretty good bond right off the bat. In my case with the tear aid stuff, the labeling says that it's got a 90% strength right there, right immediately upon putting it on. And then after about an hour or two, it will reach 100% adhesion. So now with the patch job done, the easy part is over. The hard part is now making the modification to the grommets of the trekking pole tips. And for that, you're going to want to get some rubber grommets. Now, according to the post that I saw, the recommended size of those was a ½ inch outside diameter, or OD, with a 7/32 inch thickness and a 5/16 inch groove diameter and a 3/16 inch inside diameter, or ID. And with an inside diameter of that size, it's hardly going to let anything through, and certainly not any tips of any trekking poles out there. Now for me, I was not able to find these at my local Home Depot, but I did find them in stock at both my local Ace Hardware and Lowe's. And since I happen to be at Lowe's for something else, I was able to pick some up there. So that's where I'd recommend looking for these, is your local Ace Hardware or Lowe's, and see if they have that size there. And again, remember, it's important that you actually get rubber grommets and not rubber washers. Grommets will have a little bit of a groove around the outside diameter, which is important for placing it in the existing grommet of the tent. And that brings us to the next step. Once you do have rubber grommets in hand, you're going to want to take one of them and pick one of your apex peak points of your tent and flip it inside out and locate that existing grommet where your trekking pole tip would typically go. And then you're going to have a good old wrestling match, getting that grommet to slide in and take its place inside the existing grommet. So what I found helpful for this part was taking the grommet and pushing it in from the back side of the grommet that was already in the tent. And it's still going to be quite a chore to get that in there. So if you have to, you might need to get something like a little popsicle stick or some other skinny but blunt-ended object that'll help you kind of push the edges up, under, and through the existing grommet. And then you're just gonna have to work at it and work at it and work at it. You might work at it like even like a bicycle tire a little bit, and do that until you have the full outside edge of that rubber grommet flush with the outside edge of that brass grommet. And then of course you want to check the other side and make sure it looks the same on the other side. So the ideal here is to get the inside edge of the existing brass grommet in the tent to take up that outer groove in the rubber grommet, and just make sure that's all aligned evenly. And then once you have that challenge successfully accomplished, you get to do it all over again with the other grommet in your tent. And then once that's all done, you can test it out and check that diameter once more. Try to put a trekking pole tip through the grommet now, and I think you'll find that the trekking pole tip will not push through the other side of the grommet at all. So it will hold the tip of your trekking pole tight and low and keep that tip of your trekking pole from pushing up into the fabric above the grommet when you pitch your tent. And that should certainly prevent any hole from developing if you haven't had a hole develop yet. And if you have had a hole and had it all patched up like me, then you should definitely not have to worry about anything happening any further with that hole. So there you have it, guys. A simple, quick fix to a little bit of a tear that was the unfortunate result of a lack of foresight on the original build of these X-Med tents. And then, of course, a modification to prevent a tear from happening on either side of my tent again. And so like I mentioned, that's a second successful repair on this tent that I've had to make. The first being the mesh panel here on the inner piece of the tent. I had this tent out on a trip a few years ago, and I took an alcohol stove with me and I set it up to cook kind of halfway in the vestibule here, but I also had the storm flap open, and I thought I was good with an adequate windscreen around it. But nope, still got a little bit of a breeze that pushed the flames out, the uncontrollable flames that you get with most alcohol stoves. And unfortunately, before I knew it, all of the bug netting or no-seam mesh here on this panel next to my door just melted through, just completely melted out. Big, huge hole in my tent. And that sucked because that was literally my first night out sleeping in it myself. And I was so excited to get this out at the time. And yeah, not cool. And just like with the patch job up here, I certainly, with this one being my fault, I had to rely on myself to get it fixed. So I had the option to either send it out to a shop and try to have them match fabric to it, find a matching mesh, and try and figure out a pattern for that panel and get it sewn in with their professional sewing equipment, or do what I did. I went through a ripstop by the roll, got all their samples of all their 3 different varieties of no-seam mesh, found one of them to be pretty much a perfect match for the no-seam mesh that was already on the tent here. And I basically de-stitched the edges of what was left of the panel, then ended up creating a pattern as best as I could to the dimensions of this panel here, and then I just cut that out and sewed in a new panel. So double stitched it just like the factory, but of course I had to do a single line of stitches each time because I just have a simple sewing machine, and so the stitching is not perfectly parallel with each other, but it's functional, and I'm quite proud of myself, because if you don't look too closely at the stitching, you can't tell that this tent ever had a replacement on this panel of fabric back here. So that's the story of my first repair that I had to do. And yeah, anyhow, I hope this video was helpful to any of you, the few of you out there that may be in the same boat as me. that have these original XMed one-person models. Yeah, if you guys liked it, go ahead and show your support there. Click that like button, I appreciate that. And then subscribe if you haven't. So until next time, guys, happy hiking.